I'm Tim Ventura, and I'm speaking today with Dr. Robert Bussard, former Assistant Director at the Atomic Energy Commission and founder of the Energy Matter Conversion Corporation. Dr. Bussard is one of the true pioneers in modern fusion research and joins us to talk about a new technology he's developed for cheap, clean fusion energy. Well, I'd like to start out by asking about the state of modern fusion research. I think that most people are aware that fusion research is a collection of big dollar research projects in government and academia, but I'm not sure how much anybody knows about the progress being made in this field. Can you describe for us the current state of fusion research in the United States and how much money this progress is costing us?
Tim, it's a very complicated topic because fusion research goes back to control fusion research goes back to 1952, when it was all classified, and Lyman Spitzer at Princeton University invented a machine he called the stellarator that would try to make controlled fusion happen. And from that point on until 1956 at the Geneva Conference, Atomic Energy Conference, that when it was finally declassified, because the Russians appeared and spoke openly about it, it was a classified program. And then from that point on, it's been continuous government investment in a particular line of approach that was adopted by nearly all the physicists of the Western world. So far, $18 billion has been spent in 56 or 58 years, and they're no really closer to success than they were at the beginning, except in the sense that they've learned more about why things aren't working as they wish they would. The problem with the main programs of the Western world is that they're all based on trying to control and confine fusion reactive ions by using magnetic fields. And unfortunately, magnetic fields don't really confine plasmas. A plasma is a combination of equal numbers of negative electrons and positive ions. It's the positive ions that make fusion. So a plasma is a neutral thing overall, made up of both positive and negative charges. And magnetic fields don't confine these things. They actually constrain their motion to a predictable level if you manage to avoid instabilities, but they are not able to hold them in place. And that's a fundamental physics problem that plagues all these equilibrium, Maxwellian, local equilibrium plasma machines that everyone is trying to build. It's fundamental physics difficulty that drives the machines that they try to build to huge sizes. If you've looked at the PR releases from the government over the many decades, you'll see that these toroidal, tokamak, big magnetic donut things are the size of small factories, as a friend of mine said. And they cost tens of billions of dollars if you scale them to the size where anybody thinks they might make net power. And they're not economical. They won't do anything the utilities like, and the utilities have been telling them that for 30 years, and the government programs go on anyway because it is interesting and good science. It doesn't necessarily mean we're ever going to get to an economical fusion power plant that way.
Well, I think that our troubles in the Middle East really have highlighted our need for energy independence from foreign oil. But I'm not talking about Iraq or bin Laden. I'm talking about OPEC and the 1973 oil crisis. Given that a lot of this research was really born out of events that happened 30 years ago, I'm wondering what the timeline is for the big government approach to tokamak-style fusion.
Well, I was an assistant director of the thermonuclear division of the AEC in 1971 through 73 when it was headed by Dr. Robert Hirsch. Dr. Hirsch is a very brilliant man who earlier had worked with Philo T. Farnsworth on the things that we are now pursuing, but he was then the head of the thermonuclear fusion program at the AEC, and he had several assistant directors, of which I was one. When the Arabs and the OPEC business in the early 70s decided to astound the world by raising the prices arbitrarily, and everybody saw there was an energy problem. The AEC under Hirsch decided we'd capitalize on that to try to raise enough money to see if we couldn't get fusion research really moving in the Atomic Energy Commission. Because up till that point, from the 50s, it had run at a relatively small level, split amongst 5 national labs, and nobody was really getting particularly anywhere except understanding instabilities and the problems of confining neutral plasmas. So what we did was we went to Congress and created a program that eventually reached something like $800 million a year in 1970 type dollars. It escalated because we could say, look, if you can get fusion to work, you don't have to keep using oil. But the problem with the Maxwellian systems is they all have to use deuterium, the second isotope of hydrogen, and tritium, the third isotope. And tritium is a radioactive material you have to manufacture by neutron capturing lithium-6. And it's an enormously complicated process in an engineering sense. And the reason they do that is because it's the most easiest probable way to make fusion between ions, and it's the only thing that can possibly work with a magnetic Maxwellian equilibrium system. So what we did when we raised the money, started the program in the early 70s and raised the money through Congress, the three of us who really put that through, Dr. Hirsch, myself, and Dr. Alvin Tremelpiece, said, look, let's get a lot of money here going to make the national labs feel happy so they will be able to pursue their own interests in this at levels that they're happy with, and we'll take 20% off the top and use it to study the things that we really know should really be done at our smaller scale. We'll find other people to do it. And the problem with that approach was that all three of us left within 9 months. And the people who inherited the program thought it was all real and the program should go forward with Maxwellian magnetic tokamaks. And it's been that way ever since.
Well, in 1995, you wrote a letter to most of the physicists and government administrators in the hot fusion field, as well as the influential members of Congress on the funding committees in House and Senate, saying that you, as well as the other two gentlemen, had supported tokamak designs in the 70s for these political reasons you just discussed. I'm wondering what kind of response you got from this.
Yeah, no response at all, because the plain fact is what we were saying is the program was completely derailed after we left. Nobody understood that we were doing it to try to raise enough money to scoop some off the top to try new real things, and it became a budget program. I think Professor Larry Lidsky at MIT said it best. He wrote an article in the MIT Technology Review called The Trouble with Fusion, and his article, the burden of it was the moment the program became very large in budget, it became a big budget program and ceased to be a fusion research program, and everybody spent their time worrying about continuing the large budgets year after year so that they could keep on with their large-scale laboratories. And that's a human failing. I mean, people want things to stay the way they are and to grow and don't bother me, you know. And we left, and that was it.
Well, now that we've painted a rather bleak picture for the conventional approach, I want to talk about something different, your technology, because you've been working on a form of inertial electrostatic confinement fusion for many years now, and I'm wondering if you could describe, could you start out by describing what the Iec Fusion is for us?
Yeah, let's go back. It all begins in 1924 with Irving Langmuir and Catherine Blodgett in the East, who wrote several papers in the Physical Review on how to produce negative potential wells by having oppositely moving ions and electrons in spherical, cylindrical, and slab geometries. They wrote these interesting papers in 1924, and then in the 1950s, Philo T. Farnsworth, who had been the inventor of raster scan television, conceived a way of using these negative potential wells that were produced by injecting opposite sign particles in opposite directions in spheres to make a negative potential well and to have ions concentrate by the radial electric field in the sphere to make fusion in the center of it. And he filed some very extensive patents in the late 50s, 60-page patents. They're like physics textbooks. Philo Farnsworth was a very ingenious man. And then he proceeded to try to build some of these machines. But the way he went about building them, the idea is to make a spherical negative electric potential well, to drop ions into that potential well, and they will circulate back and forth like marbles in a well, rolling back and forth, hitting each other now and then at the center. As they come to the center, they get denser and denser because 1/r² convergence. And as they hit each other at the center, they either scatter back out and go back up the well, giving their energy back to the well. They keep doing this 1,000 times, and eventually they hit and make a fusion. They make a fusion at the center. The fusion products will then be very energetic, and they will leave the system radially and fly out toward the walls. And when they hit the walls, they make heat. So you can take the energy out with steam pipes on the walls, and take it out and run steam turbines and make electricity if you want to do that. And if the particles are charged, you can put a grid out there and make direct electric conversion. The point is that it's a spherical colliding beam machine. It's not a Maxwellian mixed plasma machine. It's completely out of equilibrium. And he achieved these spherical wells by putting in screen grids, spherical screen grids, like two sieves back to back inside a sphere. And by biasing the internal screen grids to a high positive potential, high negative potential, he could accelerate ions from outside through the screens, and they would come to a focus in the center. And he had a young postgraduate student, Dr. Robert Hirsch, working with him, and they built little machines, and they actually did this, and they made world-breaking results because they got 10 to the 10th and 10 to the 11th fusions per second on DT out of these little things that are 6 inches in diameter, 6 or 8. And that was the beginning of it. The problem was that Farnsworth knew, and his patents show and disclose, that they could never make net power because the ions had to go back and forth through the grids, the sieves, the screen grids. Every time they went back through the grids, they had a chance of hitting the wires of the grids and getting lost and losing themselves in their power. And they had to go back and forth through the grids over 1,000 times before they would make a fusion in the middle. And there's no grid that's that transparent. And so the machine could never make net power, but it did make interesting fusion output. Along about that time, 3 other people at Los Alamos, Bill Elmore, Jimmy Tuck, and Ken Watson, wrote a paper, Elmore, Tuck, Watson, in which they inverted the potential geometry. They had, instead of negative voltage on the screens, they put positive voltage on the screens, and then they would, in the paper, inject electrons. Electrons would be accelerated by the positive screens and would come inside the screen and make a negative potential well, into which you could then drop the ions inside the screen. So the ions wouldn't go back and forth through the screens and hit them. However, the electrons would. The electrons would have to make 100,000 to 1,000,000 transits before a fusion occurred, and that killed that idea because you couldn't get net power because there's no screen so transparent that the electrons would not hit it. So the existence of these screen-gridded systems allowed you to produce fusion, but not in any way that would ever get to net power. That was the beginning of all this, and Dr. Hirsch was a key developer of this work with Farnsworth. I believe he still has one of the machines on his desk at his office in Virginia.
So
what did we do? Well, you want to know what we did that was different? We got rid of the screens. I realized after some time that the problem was hitting the screens, and you couldn't solve it as long as you used screens to provide the electric potential. There's only one other way you can provide the potential without screens, and that's to try to contain the electrons with a magnetic field. Well, that's a perfectly good idea because magnetic fields don't confine neutral plasmas very well at all, but they can confine electrons indeed very well because electrons have very little mass. And if you inject electrons into a quasi-spherical magnetic field that goes towards zero at the center and has a big field at the surface, the electrons will come back and they will be reflected by the field, and they'll keep going back and forth, and never see a screen. The loss problem is you must find a way to keep the losses of electrons from migrating across the fields to hit the magnetic coils that produce the fields that otherwise confine them. So you traded the predictable loss of hitting screens, which you can't solve, for a design loss of magnetic fields and coils outside, which you can control by design. And that's the whole basis of our patents and our approach, is to have a quasi-spherical magnetic field into which you inject energetic electrons that are trapped inside, go back and forth, make a negative potential well, and you drop ions in, and they never see any screens or walls, and they circulate until they make fusion.
Well, so in a sense, you're creating a negative potential well within a confined area that works a little bit like a thermos bottle. The
That's
negative
exactly
potential
right.
well is the little bottle inside of a plasma bottle that surrounds it, and the only way for hydrogen to leave the bottle is to convert into helium, so the reaction automatically ejects the reaction product to create a feed through. This sounds to me more like a fusion engine than a traditional reaction.
Oh, it is. It's more like a turbojet engine, an engine in the sense that it's not a device that you load up and ignites. It doesn't do that. It's a continuous dynamic through flow machine where you are injecting electrons. Electrons make the well, electrons make losses. The ions are independent of the electrons. You drop them in, they circulate and make fusions. And if you, it's like a turbojet engine in the sense that you inject something in at the front end, you add some fuel in the combustion chamber, and the reaction takes place, and the products go out the back. It's a continuous through flow machine. It's really a power amplifier. It's not an ignition machine.
Well, now I understand that this model is pure DD fusion, right, and has no radioactive output?
No, no, no. You can run it with the if the machinery works as it's supposed to, and as we seem to have proven it, it will work with any fusionable fuel ions. It will work with deuterium, DD. It would work with DT, which we would not like to use because of the radioactive tritium. It will work with D-helium-3. It will work with hydrogen boron 11. It just has to be driven at different voltages for these different kinds of fuels. DD is the simplest and cheapest because deuterium is available in all the seawater of the world and every glass of water you drink. 1/6000th of every gallon of every piece of water is heavy water, deuterium oxide. And deuterium you can buy at any gas welding shop. It's a perfectly good fuel. And it will make net fusion power very happily. However, when you do that, it actually makes a neutron every now and then. So it's not a non-radioactive fuel. It makes about as many neutrons as you get when you run a pressurized water fission reactor. But it has the virtue that when you turn it off, you don't have any fission products, which is the problem with fission reactors. If in the long run, what you want to do is run them on hydrogen boron 11, because hydrogen plus boron 11 makes 3 helium atoms and no neutrons. It's the only non-neutronic energy-releasing reaction we know. And if you can make a machine that runs on hydrogen boron 11, it will produce 3 helium atoms, 3 alpha particles. They're all charged, and they will leave with high velocity from the center of the machine. And you can put grids outside the machine to electrically bias to slow them down and make electricity directly without benefit of turbines. So it's an interesting long-range prospect to have clean, non-neutronic nuclear power that is directly converted to electricity at maybe 80% efficiency. That's the eventual goal.
Well, what kind of power output do you anticipate seeing from this technology, such as perhaps a successful final prototype?
Well, the next step in our major step in the development program we hope to find support for is about $150 to $200 million 100 megawatt demonstration plant. That's not a commercial plant, it's a demo plant. The commercial plants might run at 100 megawatts, and you might build them even larger to run at a standard 1,000 megawatt size central station plant. On the other hand, smaller sizes seem to be desirable to utilities people because it reduces the transmission line losses and makes a more distributed kind of grid. But you aren't going to make something much smaller than 100 megawatts for a commercial plant, I don't think. You might in the long run build something small enough to drive an 18-wheeler in the third generation hydrogen boron 11, but that's a long way off.
Okay. I'm wondering, how does the price tag for this compare watt for watt with like one of the big tokamak projects?
As we've looked at it over the years, we've done studies of what we think our plant costs and what they would look like, and we seem to conclude that the actual cost of electric power would drop about a factor of 2 from the thermal systems that produce steam and run turbines, and it might drop even a larger amount if we went to the hydrogen boron 11 with direct conversion. Hydrogen boron 11 with direct conversion, you have to build whole new plants. You don't have any turbines. You don't have hardly any. You don't have You don't have a lot of the infrastructure that conventional plants have. If you use DD, you still have some of the infrastructure because it's all going to be a steam turbine-driven system, and you're going to have to put them in pits just like you do for reactors. But that's an easy retrofit to use a DD system. You can put a DD power system down next to an existing plant that uses, it's a steam plant, and cut into the steam lines and shut off the oil boilers or shut off the fission reactors and run it on fusion. So immediately you no longer have the cost of the fuel, the $70 barrel oil that the Arabs are giving us. And the fuel cost alone is a very important part of the cost of electricity.
Well, now this current project has been underway since 1986, right? And I'm
Yeah.
wondering how much progress you've made in that time.
We had 20 years of small-scale research in our laboratories and studies and research. We've $21 million of government money has been invested in it. We've had 200,000 man-hours of technical people working in the laboratory in that time, and we have tested 15 different versions of these machines, and we have managed to lay out and define and understand and find the scaling laws for 19 different critical physics issues, one at a time. It's been a very long and tedious process because our funding was always very small compared to what the need for funding was, and that's a result of the fact that the Navy, which supported us, really couldn't ever put the right amount of money in, even though we knew what it was from the beginning, and so did they, because that would have been too large a sum of money for the budget people on Capitol Hill, and it would have become visible to the DOE, and they would have complained about it. And so the general funding political situation in Washington said, we can only fund you at a small level, and can you do anything with that? Well, we did. It took us 20 years. And as I say, all that effort and time, but we did finally succeed in solving the last basic physics problem in the last test we did in 2005. All the physics is done. All the basic physics is done. We're ready to do engineering development now.
Now, the Navy discontinued funding for your project, and I'm wondering what their reasoning was, given over 20 years of support for it. Were they politically motivated in this?
Oh, I don't think so. I don't think there's any conspiracy theory here. Well, the reason our funding died was not because the Navy did anything evil. It's because of the Iraq War. The Iraq War budgets have been just consuming everything in sight in Washington, and when it came time for the budget process for the fiscal year 2006, the Iraq War budget cut the total Navy R&D budget was cut by 26%. That wasn't us. That was all across the board. And one of the things that was cut out was a thing called the Navy Energy Program. Just cut it out. We were a victim of that. We're a little pimple down in the noise of that thing. But we died along with it. And there was no way to change that problem. And so we managed to have some friends in ONR who kept us alive for about 9 months, and that was it. And at the end of that, there was no more money.
Well, after they pulled funding, I understand that you kept running tests up until the very moment the power was shut off, and that you had some promising results that emerged from later analysis on those final tests.
Yeah, it wasn't the power being shut off. We were looking at our budgets, and we had to pay leases on our lab space, and we had to commit to yearly leases, and we couldn't do that with the budget monies that were left. There were not very much left. We had a plan where we had to close down by the 1st of November 2005. We had to start closing the lab and getting rid of all the equipment and essentially shutting it down because there wasn't any way to carry it past the end of the calendar year. But in the spring of 2005, we ran some tests on a big machine called WB5, which turned out to illuminate us from some things we should have seen for 10 years and didn't. And when we finally understood what that meant, we realized we had missed a critical point in the whole problem of electron losses, and we quickly designed and quickly built a last machine called WB6. Very different in its shape and its detailed configuration, but God is in the details, and we built it and hastily assembled it, and we tested it in September and October at low power to test some things about electron loss transport. And then in November, but by then we were approaching 1 November, and we hadn't tested it to the heavy fusion conditions yet. But I said, we have to do this. We have to finish this. So we kept right on working even past the time to shut the lab down. And on November 9th and 10th, we ran the machine for 4 times, and for the 4 times we ran it, it produced fusion from DD at a rate 100,000 or more times higher than had ever been done by Hirsch and Farnsworth at the same voltages. And we realized by measurement that we had solved the electron loss problem. Finally, at last, it was solved.
So you've really created fusion in the lab then?
Oh yeah, we've been doing that off and on for some years, but the problem was we always had too many electron losses, and we finally figured out why and solved the problem. Then on the 11th of November, we tried it again, but the hasty construction had led us to have a short in the magnet coils, and the thing arced and blew. It didn't blow up; it arced and melted down. We didn't have time or money or anything to rebuild it. So on the 14th, the following Monday, we started tearing the lab down. So in 6 weeks, we took the whole lab to zero, and it all disappeared. And we didn't even know we had the results we had for a month because we had no time to reduce the data until December. When we reduced the data, we looked at it and said, oh my Lord, look what we've done. It's actually worked. It's finally worked. All the last piece is there. The puzzle's solved. And that's it. It's a very odd situation, very ironical.
Well, while your project was funded by the Navy, the other big source for fusion funding is the Department of Energy. And
No. Yeah, you have to understand the Department of Energy is running down the road of magnetic Maxwellian local thermodynamic equilibrium magnetic confinement machines of giant scale and size with huge budgets to keep their national labs alive. They have not only no interest in anything other than that, but they have an active antipathy to anything that might be small, quick, cheap, and would compete with that. It's important, as Larry Lidsky at MIT said, to keep the big budgets alive. You have to keep funding these places. The program is running at $2 million a day, even as we speak.
Well, now you're looking at popular support to continue your research as a nonprofit, what you might call the People's Fusion, I guess.
We hope. We're looking for support from any source we can find it, a lot of rational source. The investment community is one. It's not necessarily the optimum one. And it would be nice if the Navy could find its way clear as the Department of Defense to finish the contract we have, which still has $2 million unfunded in it. I don't know if that'll ever happen, but it finally occurred to us that if the people of this country want to solve the problem of oil wars, energy conflicts, acid rain, pollution, excess gasoline prices, global warming, this is the way to do it, and it will work. And if the people want to do it, and we can find a way to get people to be partners in doing it, then there's a lot of people in America who care, I think. And if we can get the message to them, maybe they will want to support it. So we formed a nonprofit charitable R&D corporation, which there are no stockholders. Nobody's ever going to get rich from stock growth, just to do the R&D and development job to make the net power plant that is the next step. And to that end, we have this nonprofit organization in which tax-deductible donations can be sent, and if there are enough people who send it in, we'll be able to restart the work. And the way to send it in is to go to our website, www.emc2fusion.org, emc2fusion, one word, .org.
Okay.
And it will tell you all about what to do there.
Well, I'd like to ask about mobile applications for this technology. I mean, would it be potentially possible at some point to scale this reactor down enough to fit inside an aircraft or maybe even a car?
Well, I mentioned earlier we did years ago look at what it would take to scale it down, a hydrogen boron 11 clean machine. We couldn't figure out, even with a third generation system, which involves certain kinds of interesting physics compression issues in the center from instability drives, but we couldn't figure out a way to get it much below to drive an 18-wheeler truck. That's about the smallest we could make it. You could certainly build it to drive trains. I don't know about airplanes. It's basically a thermal or electrical energy producer, and I suppose you could drive airplanes. We turned to the space world because we were very interested in that. You could certainly build engines that are rocket-type engines that would make ground-to-orbit transit like 100 times cheaper than anything else. But I'm not sure that constitutes an airplane. It's a horizontal takeoff and landing, HTOL to LEO. I suppose you could think of it for airplanes, but Possibly not, but you could run trains with it, and I like the idea of the 18-wheeler anyway.
Well, I guess for the automotive applications, you'd probably want to use the fusion generator as a means of generating hydrogen to power them, right? Not as a direct fuel source.
No,
So,
we were going to use a PB11 system in an 18-wheeler to make an electric drive at about 1 megawatt.
mm.
For 1,000 kilowatts. It's more power than they've got, and it's an easy way to go.
Well, there's been a lot of buzz recently about hydrogen in the automotive world, and I'm wondering how this technology might help America migrate from fossil fuels to hydrogen as a fuel.
Well, it can. The only thing it can do to help is it can make electricity very cheaply, and therefore you can do electrolysis to produce hydrogen at lower cost than you can by any other conventional means. The problem with hydrogen, the hydrogen economy, is that it takes more energy to make the hydrogen than you get back by burning it. Unless you, and if the energy cost of making it exceeds the energy cost recoverable, it's a loser. So the only way a hydrogen economy works is if you can find some way to make the hydrogen cheaply, which means in electrolysis make the electricity cheaply. Well, this can certainly help with that. I think, though, for mobile fuels, the better solution is to go to anhydrous ethanol, pure ethanol, because you can make pure ethanol with this machine because the steam it can make as a steam generator is so cheap that you can afford to make anhydrous ethanol at about 35 cents a gallon. This is very different than the $3.50 a gallon that it costs to make it in normal processes like corn and, it's alcohol. But 35 cents a gallon is cheap enough that even the oil companies could sell it at 90 cents a gallon and everybody would profit. They'd profit, the people would profit, there'd be no smog, and the third world countries where the sugar cane is grown would suddenly have a lot of income.
Well, the big three automakers have been hurting for years from these competitive import autos. And given the price tag that you've been talking about for these fusion generators, I'm wondering if it might not be cost effective for them to invest in fusion to thereby secure a distribution advantage for the next generation of American autos.
I don't know who would do that. My impression of corporate America is that it's driven highly by 6-month accounting practices, that people are looking at the bottom line in the near term, and nobody is really interested in the American manufacturing world in a 10-year payoff, and that we aren't going to get this thing running commercially for about 10 years no matter what we do. I mean, it's 5 years to build a demo plant, then it'll be 5 years to deploy some things into retrofit on commercial power plants. And it's about a 40-year half-life to displace all the other energy sources of the world, but that will happen. With that 45, that's historical. I mean, when you made the transition from wood to coal, it took 40 years, and coal to oil, same thing. Why? Because there's a lot of infrastructure you're going to have to displace, and people want to get their investment money out of it. It's not evil, and it's not anything bad. It's just the way things work.
Well, you also gave a presentation at Google not too long ago discussing the possibility of building this device for less than the cost of their annual power bill. Can you tell me about how that went?
We had a good time. I was very impressed that Google people in the place is a wonderfully interesting place, very dynamic. I was invited there. I don't know quite how it all happened. It was sort of an accident. I know that the man who discovered our work took it to Larry Park, who said, well, have the man come up and give us a talk. I never met the Park or Brin, the founders, but I met a lot of nice people there. We had a good time, and I gave a talk that I thought was interesting to them. I didn't go to Google to seek their money because I didn't think that was practical. They're in a totally different world. They're in the IT world. But it was fun anyway. And then it turns out that they put it on the internet, and the Google website has now had 117,000 hits. So people are looking at it.
Well, will the availability of deuterium or other nuclear fuels be a limiting factor?
Oh, Lord, no. Deuterium is 1 part in 6,000 in every piece of water on the Earth. I mean, it's inexhaustible, 10 billion years worth of supply. And boron, if you do hydrogen boron is the 10th most populous element in seawater. And there already exist processes to extract it cheaply. There's enough boron in the oceans to last several billion years. I mean, and hydrogen is the basis of water, H2O. There's enough of that forever. Mm. It's a fuel that is cheap, it's essentially free, and it can't be carteled. Nobody can control it.
Well, I'd also like to ask about your thoughts on alternative nuclear theories, such as cold fusion, bubble fusion, and there are a bunch of concepts that really don't. They're not easily quantifiable, I guess. Like Dr. Ruggero Santilli's claim that it's possible to generate neutrons. Um, do you have any thoughts on these?
I don't. I have thoughts. I'm not deadly familiar with them, but I'm looking at them, reading about them, and seeing about them. There are a lot of ways that one can make neutrons at very low levels, which have no possible way to go beyond low levels. Cold fusion is one of them. Indeed, in lattices, you can in fact make little fusion reactions occur. It just you can't ever make them occur at a level of any interest in the sense of the power world of power. Steve Jones at Brigham Young University, quite apart from Pons and Fleischmann, was working on this long before Pons and Fleischmann, and it was perfectly good microphysics. The bubble fusion thing, I'm not so sure that really is a real effect, but if it is, it's going to be a very small effect like all the rest of it. Anything there are little oddities like that in the world that can make a few neutrons, but they don't scale anywhere. You can't make them go anywhere.
Yeah, Santilli's claim is that he's working on trying to validate Rutherford's hypothesis that the neutron is a compressed hydrogen atom, and he claims that he's creating and detecting neutrons in the lab by running an electrical arc through hydrogen gas. So,
Well, that's sort of like the man in Argentina in the 1950s who managed to get Perón to support him to study fusion, the German. I just don't think that's going to be real. The other thing is there are a lot of little gadgetry things around that people look at, but when you examine them, they're all Maxwellian. They're all mixed Maxwellian plasmas, and anytime you have a mixed Maxwellian plasma, which is supposed to be magnetic field confined, you are in real trouble. You're not going to get there.
oh, because the magnetic field won't confine the neutral particles.
They don't, and the neutral plasma particles, you can't do anything but DT with them because you can't run PB11 in a mixed equilibrium plasma because the radiation losses from what's called bremsstrahlung just simply overwhelm everything else. The only reason you can run hydrogen boron 11 in our machines is because the thing is completely out of equilibrium. The electrons at the center are cold, the ions are very hot, if you want to look at it that way, and so the electrons being cold don't radiate.
Well, for nearly 20 years now, there's really been a rift between supporters of hot and cold fusion. But, I mean, given the slow progress being made in both of these camps, I'm wondering if you feel there's anything that these two groups can learn from each other to balance the creativity and innovation, I guess, of the L&R crowd with the academic rigor that comes out of hot fusion.
I don't know. I don't know what to say about the small-scale stuff, except I don't see any of it that I see that has any hope of growth to being useful in a commercial, global power sense. It's great and interesting microphysics, but I don't think it goes anywhere. I don't know what you mean by learning from each other. The tens of thousands of people who've been spending the $18 billion in the last 56 years on magnetic confinement fusion are all locked into that particular world of physics. Their whole mindset is there. They don't even have a history of thinking about other things.
Yeah, I thought maybe, that could help them kind of get around that paradigm, I guess.
Why should they? They're getting $2 million a day.
Well, it's an excellent point. Yeah, I think a growing number of people, like myself, are becoming increasingly disenchanted with the dogmatism in both hot and cold fusion communities, and we're seeing a lot more innovative concepts like yours, as well as there's a vortex plasma fusion idea that is kind of interesting, and these don't really fit into either category in a sense.
Yeah, but all those little things, you examine them and go back to fundamentals, and if the fundamentals are that they're mixed Maxwellian plasmas, you're never going to go beyond DT, A, and B, if it's magnetically confined, you're never going to get to net power. It's fundamental. It's a fundamental physics that limits you. You can make all the stories you want, but it doesn't work. The only way you're going to get there is by a non-equilibrium, out-of-equilibrium driven system. It goes back to the electrical engineering of Langmuir and Blodgett and Farnsworth and electrical engineering of the 30s and 40s, 1930s and 40s.
Well, I'd like to touch on another key area in your career, which is space research. In the 60s, you played a pivotal role in the AUC's Nerva nuclear rocket program. Can you tell me about that experience and what
Oh,
lessons you learned from it?
oh heavens! I invented the program. Uh, really, I wrote a paper in 1953 in Oak Ridge National Laboratory, where I was at the time, on nuclear rocket propulsion, and I had based some of it on work done earlier by Howard Seifert and by Arthur Rourke and George Gamow and Nick Smith at Johns Hopkins in the late 40s, and by people at North American in the late 40s, and by a very fine paper by Hu Shen, the Chinese who later built the Chinese ICBMs, in a book on nuclear energy came out of MIT. But I put a definitive paper together which had a lot of nuclear calculations in it due to Carroll Mills' work at Oak Ridge, and could show by systems analysis that nuclear rockets would outperform chemical rockets for heavy payload missions over long ranges and for interplanetary missions too. And that seemed to attract the attention of the Air Force and the science advisory boards of the Air Force, and that ended up starting the National Nuclear Rocket Program in spring of 1955, both at Livermore and at Los Alamos. And so I left Oak Ridge and joined Los Alamos. We did, in fact, build reactors. I think it was 17 reactors, and ended up with a 250,000-pound thrust engine that could be run 40 times on and off. And we had a perfectly brilliant program that was technologically successful. We were running hydrogen through graphite cores at very high temperatures, all carefully controlled, which would give specific impulses 2.5 or 3 times higher than anything you could get from general chemical propulsion. And the idea was that you're going to use it for, the original idea was to use it to carry, weapons on ICBMs. It's a second stage rocket. But that went away after a while because the bombs got smaller and the rockets got better. It ended up being a program that was controlled by NASA, aimed at spaceflight. And we even had a target. It was the 1978 opposition of Mars. Manned Mars in 78. And a program to do that fell flat because of internecine wars, political wars between the chemical rocket community and the nuclear rocket community, and the budget office, and Livermore and Los Alamos, and the long story about that, which is recounted in a book by Jim Dewar called To the End of the Solar System. It's the best book ever written on the history of that program.
Mm.
And the program was very successful. But of course, along came the Vietnam War, and that sort of killed everything. And so the program vanished and went away. We had 50 years ago nuclear rockets that could take people to Mars.
Well, if NASA wanted to deploy Nerva now, how much of the 60s experience and technology would still be applicable?
I think it would all be applicable. All you have to do is resuscitate it. Most of the people who did it are either retired or dead. But the technology is not hidden. It's in reports, and people can easily resuscitate it if you spend a little time and money at it.
Well,
It'll take time and money, but I don't see NASA doing that because NASA's budget is hammered into the ground by the Iraq War. Everything R&D is being hammered into the ground.
yeah. Do you think that technological progress since then would make such a space propulsion system even more practical?
I don't think you need to go much beyond what it was. If you just rebuilt the one you had and started there, there's a lot of new ideas that have been around, but they haven't been proven in reactor tests. I think if you start by building what you knew how to build and build them and fly them, then you improve from there. And I think we already know the directions of improvement, and I think we already know how far you can improve it with modern materials. I think you can go up to 1,200 seconds ISP instead of 860. And if you go to 1,200 seconds, everything gets vastly better, of course. We can open the solar system to human transport if we want to revive that program, but that's going to be a program that takes time and money, and NASA doesn't have any time and money.
Yeah. Well, how much time and money do you think it would require for a program like that?
I think it'd take half the NASA budget for about 10 years.
So probably about 7.5, $8 billion a year, huh?
Yeah, I think so. And then you'd have a real fleet of nuclear rocket-powered systems that could carry people anywhere you want in the solar system, anywhere you want in the inner solar system. I mean, the solar system out to Mars, anyway.
Well,
Probably the moons of Jupiter.
In terms of another space subject, Jerry Pournelle and several other science fiction writers have adopted the Bussard Ramjet as a means of traveling between solar systems. I'm wondering if you could tell us about the origin of this concept and how Pournelle and the science fiction crowd picked it up.
Oh, well, that's a different story entirely. I don't know. It occurred to me one night at dinner, actually, back in 1960. The idea of traveling in between the stars, interstellar travel. People had looked at that for years and looked at rockets and antimatter rockets and one thing and another. And as long as you do it with rockets, you have a real problem because you have to carry all your rocket reactive propulsion fuel on board, and so you have to accelerate all the stuff you haven't burned yet and carry it with you. And lots of papers were written on it by very brilliant people, Eugen Singer and Val Cleaver and people in England and so on. And it occurred to me sitting there at dinner one night that why bother to carry the fuel when the fuel is sitting out there in the spaces between the stars? It's hydrogen. What do the stars run on? They run on the fusion of hydrogen. So all you need to do in principle, is collect the hydrogen that's between the stars as you fly, put it somehow magically into a fusion engine that can run on fusion of hydrogen, which the stars do, although they're rather large, and then run the fusion engine to drive the ship so you don't have to carry your fuel. So you fly along scooping up hydrogen and making it into an interstellar ramjet. And I did the mathematics of it with the physics constraints, and it turned out it works out very interestingly. It tells you what engineering conditions you have to achieve for mass per unit area scoop and so on and so forth. And it looked like, in principle, from the point of view of the physics, you'd solve the problem. Of course, the engineering is virtually impossible today. But give us 100 years of advanced engineering, and it may be possible. There was a key feature missing, and a fellow named Daniel Whitmire, now at University of Southwest Louisiana, solved that. The problem is that the reaction rate for hydrogen-hydrogen fusion is very, very small. You have to do certain strange nuclear things to make it go. Well, he found a way to enhance that by 10 to the 16th and wrote a paper on it, and it made it all very practical. So we have interstellar ramjets. When I published a paper in 1960 on that in a journal called Astronautica Acta, and apparently that paper caught the attention of Jerry Pournelle and Larry Niven and other people in the science fiction writing community, and I didn't even know that. So 10 years later, I got an invitation from Jerry to come talk at a Nebula Award dinner. And I said, well, why? And he said, well, we're all using your ramjet. I said, you are? I didn't know that. So I went and gave the talk.
Well, what about your current IEC technology? How difficult would it be to deploy something like that for space travel?
Well, that was the burden of 8 papers that we wrote in the period from 1993 to 1994 to 2004 or 2005. We were under an embargo by the Navy not to write papers on our physics. For 11 years, we were not allowed to publish or go to conferences. And during that time, though, they didn't care if we wrote about papers about spaceflight that said if we had an engine like this, a source like this, what could we do with spaceflight? But they just didn't want us to talk about the source. So I wrote 8 different papers on aspects of engine design for space propulsion. And they were given at international conferences and AIAA propulsion conferences and so on. The bottom line is what it shows is that with this approach, you can make an engine system, a spectrum of engines that outperforms all of any other competitor by a factor of about 1,000. You either have 1,000 times the specific impulse at the same thrust-to-weight ratio or 1,000 times higher thrust-to-weight ratio at the same specific impulse. And when you apply that engine system to all the missions in the solar system, everything changes. You have single-stage transit to Mars in 3 weeks with a single-stage 20% payload vehicle. You have transit round trips to the moon in 24 hours. You have HTOL to LEO with a cost of $25 a kilogram, not $5,000 a kilogram. The whole thing becomes totally different. if you can ever get these engines built, which would take another 10 or 15 years and another $5 to $7 billion. Give it to Marshall Space Flight Center and let them go,
Mm. Well, there's been some buzz recently about mining the moon for helium-3, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that concept.
I don't think it's it's not necessary. It's a real difficulty. I think there's no question helium-3 on the moon, and no question you could mine it at whatever large cost it would be. But as I see it, it's a completely unnecessary thing to do. Because while there's no helium-3 on Earth, if you have a fusion reactor that can run on DD, deuterium and deuterium, half of the reactions produce helium-3. Half of the DD reactions make helium-3. That means you can take the helium-3 you have produced in the DD reactor, pipe it out of the vacuum system, and feed it back into the machine and burn it as D-helium-3. You are manufacturing your own fuel as you go. So why would you go to the moon? If you have a DD reactor, you have a D-helium-3 producing reactor.
Well, this piping almost sounds... I mean, to use the engine example, then I guess this would almost be like a turbocharger.
Well, I know this is for ground power plant, really. Well, I mean, I wouldn't try to do this in a... Why bother? You're going to do PB-11 for spaceflight. You don't want any neutrons. But in a ground power plant, I mean, D-helium-3 is fine. You can't make a D-helium-3 reactor that's neutron-free. It's impossible, because as long as you have D, you're going to have side DD reactions that are going to produce a neutron in the other half of the chain. You cannot avoid that. So D-helium-3 does not give you a pure, clean fusion system. It may reduce the level by factors of 10, 20, or even 40, but it will still make neutrons, enough that you have to have really significant shielding. But the idea of using helium-3 to get more energy is perfectly fine, but you're going to have a DD plant that makes helium-3 anyway. I mean, you don't really need to go to the moon to do any of that. That's the point.
Yeah. Well, so I guess I should probably reiterate for the audience that it sounds like you've made the breakthrough. You're there with fusion.
Well, we think so. We've finished the physics. We've finished the physics after 20 years. The basic physics, I'm sure there's some more lying out there we haven't seen, but the basic physics that allows us to go to engineering development has been done. We're ready to do engineering development work, which means control systems and fuel systems and the things that make the hardware work.
Well, your website's online at emc2fusion.org, and
Right.
donations can be made at the New Mexico Community Foundation.
Yeah, there's a big button on the website to push, and you push it, it goes right to the New Mexico Community Foundation donation page.
Well, I'd like to wrap things up by saying thank you yet again for a remarkable interview, and asking, if you have any thoughts in close.
Well, just that it would be nice that we get off of the fossil fuel business and stop energy conflicts and clean up the planet, and this is the only way I know how to do it.